Welcome to the Black Swan Rising podcast, an L10 production. For transcriptions, show notes, and extras, please visit us at theblackswanrisingpodcast.com. Now, broadcasting across the world from the heart of the American Bible Belt, here is your host, Michael B. Rush.
Welcome back to the Black Swan Rising podcast. I'm your host, Michael B. Rush. Well, I'm going to change things up a bit. I had mentioned on a prior or last week's episode that I was going to talk about my trip to Europe, but I'm changing it up. I'm going to talk about Black Swan events that I see coming on the horizon, because that is, after all, what this podcast is all about. So the reason we're doing this is I've actually been asked by numerous folks, hey, what Black Swan events do you see on the horizon? Let's review what a Black Swan event is really quickly. So a Black Swan event is something that nobody sees coming, but in retrospect, once it occurs, it becomes obvious that this was always going to happen. And when it happens, it changes everything. The world is not the same after the Black Swan event. So I think there's actually a bunch of potential Black Swan events looming on the horizon. But I want to start with a potential financial Black Swan event. My background is in finance. I'm a finance guy, and finance really impacts everyone's lives, whether you want to understand finance or not. So let's talk about this event that I see looming on the horizon. This is potentially something that is just bonkers. I'm talking about something that is called the yen carry trade. And maybe you've heard about that, maybe you haven't, but let me just explain to you what this is all about. So the Fed, they kept interest rates at or near zero for a very, very long time. And it wasn't until the COVID pandemic crisis that they started to raise interest rates, because the COVID crisis disrupted global supply chains, and that disruption caused inflation to start going crazy. And frankly, it hasn't normalized since. So the Fed started raising interest rates, and they did it with a vengeance. We went from basically zero to about 5.25% in a very short period of time. Now, the rest of the world didn't do that. Japan, for instance, they did not do that. They left their interest rate at zero during this period of time. So some folks started going, holy smokes, if I borrow in yen, I can essentially borrow at 0% interest rate, and I can take that money and I can invest it in the United States, and I can invest it in something that is very safe. In the investment world, the risk-free investment is the US Treasury bond. So folks started out by borrowing Japanese dollars and invested in US debt. And because this was a risk-free investment, per se, the assumption was that the U.S. would never default on its debts, but there were other risks involved here, such as the exchange rate. But historically, the Japanese yen had only been weakening. If you look back in history, you can see that this is true. For example, the exchange rate for U.S. dollar to Japanese yen was about 103. It took 103 yen for $1. Just earlier in the month of August, it took 164 yen to buy $1. That means that if you had borrowed these yen, it is only becoming cheaper for you to repay those because the yen is weakening against the dollar. So people have been saying, man, this is a home run. I'm borrowing all of this stuff. It's only getting easier for me to repay. And recently, the Japanese government has started to raise interest rates but not by much. They raised it by, like 0.25%. So it's gone from 0 to 0.25%. The currency has depreciated over 20% over this same period of time. Hedge funds have jumped into this all in. The amount of US securities now that are being purchased on the yen carry trade is at all-time highs. But what are the unintended consequences of this? Well, we're talking about $4 trillion has entered into the U.S. investment market since this carry trade became a thing. In the last 2 years, you've seen this just balloon, and now it's crazy. So think about it this way. When you look at the value of the U.S. stock market, it's massive. But how is that value determined? Well, it's determined by what current shares are going for. The stock market is always an auction-based system, right? And if you bring $4 trillion and you want to invest that into the U.S. stock market because you say, well, the U.S. economy is the strongest in the world and it's only going to go up. Well, essentially, you take this free money and you come over and you start dumping it into the U.S. stock market. $4 trillion has a disproportionate impact on the U.S. stock market because you're not just buying $4 trillion worth of stock at the current value, because there's really not $4 trillion of stock for sale at the current prices. In order to get that many shares, you have to drive the auction price up. And that is exactly what we saw happen in the U.S. stock market over this same yen carry trade period of time. For instance, when the yen carry trade really became a thing, the Dow Jones Industrial Average go from about 35,000 to, what is it today, over $53,000. You really see this when you look at the cyclical adjusted price earnings ratio. The stock market, if you look at this ratio over time, it's really hovered around maybe on average around 17. Well, you look at that today, it's about 41. So companies are being valued at 41 times their earnings. That is bonkers. It's not the highest they've ever been. The highest that they've ever been valued at was right at the dot-com bubble. They were valued at just around 44 times earnings. And that, of course, was a massive bubble that dropped when that bubble burst. It went from around 44 times earnings all the way down to about 15 times earnings. So I think that we could be looking at something like that, because this yen carry trade, it's not the only thing that's going on right now. It's one of the massive drivers to this, I believe. There is no reason, a rational explanation anyway, that the entire stock market should be valued at 41 times earnings. And in reality, it isn't the entire stock market that's valued at this. This is actually much worse than this, because it's really probably 25 companies that is driving the majority of the move right now. And that is where all of this money has been dumped, because everyone is looking at the AI as being the next big thing. And of course, it is going to be the next big thing, just like the internet revolutionized, commerce, across the world. AI is going to revolutionize commerce across the world. But what about the unintended consequences? There was recently a Wall Street Journal article that highlighted the fact that there are $3 trillion of off-balance sheet commitments related to AI spending. This is data centers and commitments to build data centers that haven't yet been built out, but there are contractual obligations for these large companies to make future lease payments on these buildings once they are built out. And those lease and purchase agreements commit these companies to cash flow payments that are around $3 trillion. Well, the problem is that for most of these companies right now, because of how much money they are spending, and they're spending this much money because their valuations have gone through the roof, and their valuations have gone through the roof because of this whole yen carry trade where you have this massive amount of essentially free money that's been dumped into the market and has what Alan Greenspan called irrational exuberance has entered into a degree that we have not seen since the 2000 dot-com bubble. And what happened in the dot-com bubble? Well, because people had spent so much money on this, you had all of these companies that were competing. They had built out all this infrastructure, and now they had to compete on price, because the irrational exuberance had gone away and they had all of this capacity and they had to fill it somehow. Well, we're going to see that exact same thing happen with AI, and we're going to start seeing it very soon, because these AI companies, they're going to have to start justifying all of this infrastructure build out. And what is the easiest efficiency that AI is going to bring to the table? Well, unfortunately, the low-hanging fruit here, guys, is the middle class. And you look at the white collar workforce here. You look at the accountants, the paralegals, the engineers, the code writers. That is the bulk, the white collar workforce, the middle class. That is the driver to the US economy, because the uber wealthy, they have so much money that they can't spend it all. And the lower class, blue collar workers, they're living paycheck to paycheck. So it is the white collar workforce that is driving consumption in America. And it's that same workforce that AI is going to replace. Because I'll tell you, friends, coming from the finance industry myself, there is nothing magical about doing accounting. And in fact, when you take the complexity that has been introduced into the accounting world, AI is going to be able to handle that much better than human being counters are going to be able to handle that. And so you're going to start seeing AI replace the traditional accounting workforce in a massive way. You're going to see the same thing happen in engineering and code writing. You name it. Anything that a white collar person is doing can probably do it better, faster, and cheaper. Now, you are always going to have some folks that are shepherding the AI, but the number of folks that are required to shepherd the AI is dramatically less than what it takes to shepherd human beings. And so the unintended consequence, I believe, that I see coming down the road is that AI is going to cannibalize our payroll. And yes, the short-term impact is going to be that it is going to make companies much more profitable, because they're going to be able to reduce their payroll significantly because of the benefits that AI bring. However, that significant reduction to the payroll is going to result in a significant reduction in consumption. And consumption, the U.S. consumer drives the global economy, and AI is going to replace that. So I perceive that all of these, valuations for AI could potentially turn into a cannibalistic doom loop where more efficiencies breed more layoffs result in less consumption, and less consumption requires more and more efficiencies. And ultimately, what is there that AI cannot do better when it's taken to its ultimate capacity than a human being? Now, keep in mind that this issue exists independently of this yen carry trade issue. So you've got basically two barrels locked and loaded with two different things aimed at the US economy, which is the driver of global economy. Now, in addition to this, another potential black swan event that you have on the very near horizon is the sovereign debt crisis across the globe. Every country on the planet has been printing money like it's going out of style. And you have to look no further than the United States of America. You look at our $40 trillion in debt, and the Fed has been holding rates constant, but the market has not. The market has been discounting U.S. debt, which has resulted in yields increasing. The effective interest rate on the U.S. debt is rising, and it's rising because the market is saying the U.S. debt is carrying more risk than the interest rate compensates us for, because the U.S. continues to print more and more money. And so the risk is that you are going to inflate away this debt with this low interest rate. So I am going to require that I can buy this debt at a steeper discount to its nominal face value. And that results in an effective interest rate that is significantly higher than the stated interest rate. Right now, the United States is paying about 30% of all of its income just to service its debt. And it's becoming more expensive all the time. And other countries don't want to buy our debt anymore because they're concerned about our printing press not shutting off. And so the demand for U.S. debt, long-term U.S. debt, is falling. And so what is the U.S. Treasury doing about that? Well, they need a market for U.S. debt, even if that requires the U.S. to buy its own debt. And so the Treasury has recently announced that it is going to start stepping in and buying its own long-term debt. In other words, it's refinancing its long-term debt that has a fixed interest rate to a T-bill, and T-bills are short-term interest rates. Think of this like your mortgage rate, okay? You want to fix your mortgage rate over 30 years, right? You don't want it to be going up and up and up as interest rates go up and up and up. Countries are the same. Countries want most of their debt to be long-term fixed rate. But right now, people don't want to buy the U.S. long-term debt at the interest rates that we're saying. So we're needing to finance more of this at like a floating Treasury T-bill rate, which means that we are moving away from having $40 trillion of debt at a fixed rate to a variable rate. And we are bouncing up against inflation. And in order to combat this, we continuously change how we define inflation so that we can say, yeah, inflation is in check. It's not rising as fast as you think it is. So we don't have to raise interest rates. That's essentially what's going on. The Fed does not want to raise interest rates because if it raises interest rates, our debt service is going to be legit cray-cray and it's going to be bad news. Yet on the other hand, because we're not raising interest rates, the market is saying, well, I'm not going to buy your debt at its face value. I demand a discount. And that is essentially a higher rate anyway. So this is what's going on, not only in America, it's going on all over the world. And this is alarming. So how is the U.S. going to deal with this? Well, you can see how it is dealing with it already. It's dealing with it by printing more money. So let's look at the money supply as calculated by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. And they do this with a metric that's called the M2. If you look at the amount of money that was in circulation in the United States during the COVID crisis, right at the beginning, there was, I'm looking at the chart right now, there was $15.5 trillion of currency in circulation. Today, we are now sitting at $23 trillion in currency. So in the course of less than 6 years, the U.S. money supply has increased by 50%. That is insanity. If you look at where the money supply was at the turn of the century, the year 2000, for me, that wasn't very long ago. The money supply has gone up by almost 500%. It's almost quintupled in around 25 years. That is insane. This is why other sovereign nations are not wanting to buy our debt, because they see the writing on the wall. If we have increased our money supply by this much in such a short period of time, why would they expect that in the next 5 years, it's not going to be 50% larger still? And friends, it is impossible to print this kind of money without having inflation. And in fact, we are having inflation, and inflation is much higher than what is being reported. We just can't report it as being as high as it is, because it would require us to raise the interest rates to combat that, and raising the interest rates would, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt the United States of America, because if the interest rates were where they probably need to be to curb the kind of inflation that we are really experiencing in the country, we couldn't service the debt. So those are 3 things that I see on the horizon, and they're not small things. Any one of those could result in a major black swan event, but we don't have these in isolation. We have all 3 of them together. Let's talk about natural resources. On the Black Swan Rising podcast, I've spent prior episodes talking about the fact that there is a war for natural resources going on in the world today. Originally, the Iran war was about them obtaining nuclear weapons. Well, surprise, surprise, it seems to be entirely about the Straits of Hormuz right now. If you look at what's going on with Ukraine and Russia, and what Iran is doing, Iran is now bombing the producers of natural resource in the region. They recently bombed a helium plant in, Oman or Qatar? I can't remember off the top of my head, but it really doesn't matter. Helium is a byproduct of producing natural gas. And there's a very large percentage of the world's natural gas that is coming out of the Straits of Hormuz. And you blow up the plant that produces 1/3 of the nation's or the world's global supply of helium, you're going to have major impacts, trickle-down effects. We're not talking about helium balloons. Helium is a major component in the production of microchips. So if you have reduced the amount of helium that is available to the world, sooner or later, you will reduce the amount of microchips that can be produced by 30% as well. You have all of these AI data centers that are being built at a tremendous expense, and you may not be able to buy those microchips certainly at the price that you're getting them today, and you may not be able to get as many as you need at all. It's just saying, you look at the natural resource war, it's live. Ukraine is blowing up crude processing or refineries all over in Russia. This is just becoming a disaster, and it's a black swan event that's rolling out right before our eyes right now. But a component that I'm more focused on than anything else right now is the precious metals sector, because precious metals should be the hedge against this whole currency debasement process that is in full swing right now. But curiously, there are financial institutions in the West that have so many derivative instruments that are on gold and silver right now, it's estimated that there's probably 400 paper ounces of silver to every 1 physical ounce of silver. And what is this doing? Right now, it is driving the price of silver down. And so what are other countries doing? They are purchasing our precious metals at this paper discount. What would you expect that America's biggest export is right now? Our biggest export is precious metals. Precious metals are leaving the country because the bozos that are manipulating the price of precious metals are making them a bargain. And so other countries are buying them and we're sending it out. And there is a real disconnect here. And there's lots of folks. These are very intelligent folks. These aren't just Black Swan podcast weaselopes that are saying this kind of thing. These are major banks that are revising their projections for where gold is going to be in 12 months from now to be $8,000 to $10,000 an ounce. Oh, and why? It's because of this inflation and this currency craziness. And the fact that, we're sending all of our precious metals out because of this derivative debacle that we've got going on. I think we are going to see a black swan event with regards to the economy that will be the culmination of many things converging in a way that no one is talking about holistically. And again, guys, there's more things going on than just these handful of the 4 things that I've talked about. You've got the private credit crisis going on right now. I think that this is also something that has ballooned up nicely because of this Japanese yen carry trade. You've made all of this capital available, so people have started lending it out to get this interest rate arbitrage, if you will. You can borrow essentially for nothing from Japan and lend it out to all kinds of folks in America. And now those folks are starting to default on those loans. And you have these large investment groups that are saying, hey, yeah, if you invested in our private credit fund, well, you can't get your money back now. And they're saying that because it's a big deal. And then, a lot of this stuff goes back to accounting, believe it or not, because you have these loans. If you start writing down these loans, if anyone starts writing down these loans, then you have something that's called an impairment issue. And if you show that your investment in these private credits are impaired in some way, well, you have to write down all of those investments, because why would it be isolated to just a particular portion of that sector? And nobody really wants to do that because that can create a domino effect as well. You see the same thing in the commercial real estate market. Nobody really wants to talk about what's going on in the commercial real estate market, because if they did, they would have to revalue all of these loans. But you go to any major city and you look at what's going on in commercial real estate, you will see occupancy rates are abysmal. So what does that mean? It means that the companies that are in this sector, they're not able to service their loans. And a bank does not want to acknowledge that a large percentage of its portfolio is delinquent. So what do? They renegotiate new payment terms. They call this extend and pretend. And this just means that we're going to adjust your loan and assume that things are going to get better in the future. So now we don't have to say that this loan is in default because we've just modified the terms. And when you can't live up to those terms, we're going to modify it again, and we're going to keep this in a perpetual state of kicking the can down the road so that I don't have to show my portfolio as being significantly impaired, because then you're going to find that you have a major crisis in the regional banking industry. And that's just another potential black swan event, another of these barrels that's loaded and pointed at the US economy. So to think that the market is just going to continue going up and up and up, and that all is well in Zion, that is, sticking your head in the sand. So I think that we are headed for some serious financial turmoil, not only in the United States, but across the entire globe. Something that is so significant that we're going to require a major rehaul in order to even function. Frankly, I'm not exactly sure how we could come out of this still looking the same. Something's going to have to fundamentally change. And this is why I believe that you are starting to see the central banks all around the world divesting US Treasury debt and buying gold at unprecedented levels. And I'm not giving you investment advice, but if you only own stocks and you don't have any real assets, well, what's going to happen to your portfolio when the stock market is based off of 41 times earnings right now, and that drops down, reverts to the historic mean of 15 to 17 times earnings? Well, you're going to see your net worth drop precipitously. And hopefully you're not investing with borrowed funds, because that is going to make things even much worse for you. And you look at how much of the world hedge funds right now, they are using the scope of marginal debt that is invested right now, and just the yen carry trade is only a piece of this. You can also do this with other foreign currencies. The Swiss franc, which is considered a reserve currency, their interest rate is zero. The US dollar, the Fed is 5.25% right now. So you can borrow US francs for essentially zero and invest in US dollars. So much of the value of all of our assets is been inflated with debt. We're borrowing money and investing, and that is dangerous. So these are some black swan events that I see looming on the horizon. And these, of course, are all financial. But let's talk about some black swan events that are not financial. Let's talk about the fact that we have all of these things flying around in our sky that are being acknowledged publicly by governments around the world, including the government of the United States of America. And you have all these high quality whistleblowers that are talking about crazy non-human intelligence crafts, recovery projects, non-human biological entities, crazy things like this. If you can't see a black swan event associated with this, then you're not very creative. Let's talk about Chris Bledsoe. I've talked about many times on this. His communications with quote unquote the lady, she has told him that the world is headed for a new age where it will be entering into the age of the divine feminine. That's pretty crazy, because the timeline that he claims that this is going to be happening is soon. So that's a potential black swan event. There's another, something along those same lines. I don't know how many of you are aware of a man named John Ramirez, but John Ramirez is a former CIA officer who worked for the Directorate of Science and Technology, as well as the Directorate of Intelligence. And he's on record saying that he, from an official capacity, he is aware that in 2027, there is going to be some sort of major event that will make it impossible for governments to deny an alien presence. To me, that's kind of shocking, and it goes along with what Chris Bledsoe has been saying, that the world is about to enter into a new stage. So if you can't see a black swan event associated with that, what would happen? How would the economy change? How would religions change? How would your perceptions of reality change if you no longer wondered whether this stuff was real? You absolutely knew it was real. And you had these kinds of non-human intelligences playing a major role in society. You have numerous pastors that are on record that seem to be corroborating the fact that something like this is in the works, because they are saying that they have been pulled in to these meetings with other faith leaders from across the country, across the spectrum of religious dogmas, that are being vetted for what do you think is going to happen if this kind of disclosure occurs. They are getting ready for something, and it certainly seems that way. What does the world look like after this? This is the primary reason that I started this Black Swan Rising podcast to begin with, not to convince anybody that this stuff is real. And, there's, different online personalities that are out there making fun of me for even talking about this kind of stuff. And honestly, you can't really blame them if your traditional view of the world is that the world is based in Newtonian physics and nothing more. But what if the world and reality are not based on Newtonian physics? What if reality is governed more by things of a supernatural nature than they are governed by Newtonian physics? Religion at its core is supernatural. So it's perplexing to me that many folks in the religious community, particularly from the academic perspective, they have to make fun of people like me, because to acknowledge that there may be something dramatically different, it changes everything. Now, what if all of this is being coordinated? We've heard talk for many years about this engineered Great Reset. What if all of this stuff isn't just happening by random chance? What if the whole disclosure phenomenon and all of these catastrophic economic things are being lined up as a specific means to an end? And I know that this sounds like a total conspiracy theory, but all black swan events, when you talk about them in advance, are conspiracy theories. It's only once they have occurred that it becomes obvious from the information that was always available that they were going to occur. So now, with all of this background, let's step back and look at this simply from a scriptural perspective. From the scriptures, it is apparent that the Whore of Babylon is real. The Book of Mormon refers to the Whore of Babylon as the Great and Abominable Church. Nephi refers to it also as the whore of all the earth. John the Revelator refers to it as the Great Whore or the Whore of Babylon. Now, regardless, the Whore of Babylon is an institution that has a global footprint, and it is seeking to control all nations and people. You can read about that in Ether chapter 8. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is really what the scriptures say, that when we see these things, we need to awaken to the awfulness of our situation. Now, if there is a Whore of Babylon, and there obviously is, they are working towards that end. And the end is to be able to control everything. So, what if all of these things are not one-off things, but have been coordinated? It seems that most of this went into hyperdrive with the COVID pandemic. Interestingly enough, coordinated with the pandemic, you had the World Economic Forum release a Great Reset study in which Klaus Schwab stated that we need a great reset of capitalism. He was calling for changes involving everything: taxation, regulation, fiscal policy, stakeholder capitalism, environmental objectives, and investments. And they were even talking about how after this great reset, nobody would own anything and everyone would be happy. Well, when you look at this and you look at all of these kinds of things, if you assume that the Whore of Babylon is behind all of this, and you look at what the old system was based on, the old system was based off of private ownership. It was based off of national sovereignty, national currencies, national banking systems. It was based off of traditional employment models. It was based on market-based capital allocation. Now, all of these things that we've talked about, they potentially can turn the tables on all of that. If you have a fundamental crisis, a debt crisis, where that turns into a banking crisis, which turns into an asset valuation crisis, which turns into employment disruption, which turns into a massive fiscal crisis that turns into political upheaval and distrust of sovereign nations across the board, then you have an emergency where the entire system needs to be restructured. You need to restructure debt and the monetization of debt. You need a new monetary architecture altogether. You need a new welfare architecture altogether. I mean, if AI is making it so that the middle class worldwide becomes obsolete, you need a new welfare architecture, believe me. The digital financial infrastructure needs to be revamped. And you're going to need to look at how public and governmental institutions interface. So you're going to need this new system that handles all of those things. And when you look at what's going on in the world today, it's hard to not look at all of these individual things that are going and think that they have somehow been brought into existence organically. It seems like there is some great master plan to bring to pass a catastrophic global financial collapse. And you can't have a global reset unless you also reset the United States of America. And you can see that the United States is not going to be exempt from this. Then it becomes really interesting how you have in the background central banks working towards a completely new monetary system, as if they are getting ready for something. I don't know if you know this or are aware of this or not, but central banks, they are not independently sovereign. They are actually owned by an organization that is referred to as the Bank for International Settlements, which is located in Basel, Switzerland. And it's essentially a consortium of 63 central banks. And of course, that includes the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, and others. In fact, 95% of global GDP is accounted for by these 63 central banks that make up this Bank for International Settlements, which is commonly referred to as the BIZ. So what is the BIZ talking about right now? If this were some sort of master plan, you would expect to see it being coordinated at the level of the BIZ. And when you look at the publications and speeches of the BIZ for let's just look at it for this year alone. What are they focused on? They're focused on next generation monetary and financial systems. Their 6 biggest topics of conversation. Number 1, tokenized monetary systems. Number 2, a tokenized central bank money system. Number 3, tokenizing government debt. Number 4, cross-border settlements. Number 5, they're talking about how AI can facilitate all of this stuff. And 6, they are harping on the financial systems, the current financial systems, fragility. So to me, it seems like we have this organized disaster that they will be able to present this alternate system and make everything better. And of course, we will be in such dire straits that we will accept this. Well, friends, if you have a central bank that is global and not just national, and that it is now calling all of the shots because the entire global economy has collapsed, well, essentially, whoever owns the gold makes the rules. Whoever is controlling the monetary policy is controlling everything, particularly if you can turn that monetary unit, the tokenized digital bank currency, on and off if you are in compliance or out of compliance with the rules that this central bank has made. So to me, this seems that this central bank would be the financial arm of the Whore of Babylon. Now, from a scriptural perspective, again, the Whore of Babylon is going to rise to an apex of power before the second coming happens. Also, the Whore of Babylon is going to fall before the second coming happens. And this leads into this whole disclosure phenomena that is going on right now. What if you have this global collapse in faith in sovereign governments because of the collapse of the financial system? Then simultaneously, you have the revelation that, guys, guess what? We are not alone. And let me introduce you to our best buds. And now we are introduced to this non-human intelligence that is so far beyond us in technology and in intelligence and in financial resources that we're essentially in the Stone Ages. Now say, yeah, and guess what? These, our friends, are volunteering to step in and bail us out so that we can move to the next stage of our existence. Is this just one-off, wild and woolly, crazy, bonkers idea? Maybe. But when I read Daniel 11, and I look at many of these scriptures that talk about this Antichrist, it says that this Antichrist destroys many through peace, meaning that the world is going to be in complete chaos, and he is going to come in and say, don't worry, I got you. And people are going to exchange peace for their souls. In other words, they will abandon their faith because of this man who, according to the scriptures say that he will seek to change time and laws. Everything is going to be different. He is going to present a reality that changes everything. This will be a black swan event of all black swan events up to this point in time. If you believe some of these whistleblower accounts, these whistleblowers are saying that this entity that I refer to as the Whore of Babylon is already working with someone of non-human intelligence. And according to Dr. Stephen Greer, they are working with someone of non-human intelligence that claims to be the Messiah. You put those two things together and you have an Antichrist. So you have a Whore of Babylon who is working with an antichrist. And then you have the scriptures say that the antichrist turns on the whore of Babylon and destroys them in 1 hour. Then you have the specific wording in Daniel 11 that states that this vile person, as he is referred to in Daniel 11, does not obtain the rule of the kingdom from the whore of Babylon, but he obtains it through flatteries, meaning he gets rid of the whore of Babylon, and then the people put him in power because he's got all the answers. And then, he does bring stability, but he also turns faith upside down. Now, again, when you look at all of this stuff together and you assume, you take the contrarian approach of, okay, what if this is not all happening in isolation? What if this is being coordinated? Well, if it's being coordinated, it looks something awfully like what I've been talking about on this Black Swan Rising podcast all along. I know that this sounds bonkers, friends, but if you do an in-depth analysis of all of the scriptures that talk about these things, it is shocking how closely this seems to line up. And it would be very, very hard for me to go through and analyze all of this stuff and present it in this kind of a format, a podcast format. I've laid this stuff out in the 7 books that I've written. Notably, those 7 books, it's over 2,200 pages of information. It's getting close to 6,000 different scripture references. I can't do that in a podcast episode or even a series of podcast episodes. I need to really lay this out for you to do it justice in like a master class scenario where going to the whiteboard and walking you through these things step by step. The way that I look at this, there's 10 stages to this. And you know what? I'm starting to feel a sense of urgency to put something like this together, to put together some kind of master class on this. So I'm just going to end this episode by asking you, is that something that you think that you would be interested in, is taking a master class that just lays all of this stuff out? What I believe these Black Swan events are of the last days, and going in much more of like an academic setting and just walking through it where, people that were interested in this, it'd be more of a classroom setting and an interactive kind of an environment where the folks that were interested in something like this could ask questions in real time, and we could work through some of these things. And I could lay out the scriptural support for this kind of a rationale, because I know when you just say it, it seems completely bonkers. So let me know your thoughts on this. I would imagine that it would take me probably about 20 hours to go through a course like this. And I don't know why I want to spend that kind of time if there's no interest in doing that. So I would only do it if there is a significant interest. So if you're interested in something like that, shoot me an email, or if you're listening to this on whatever podcast platform, there is the ability to shoot me a text. I can't respond to those. I know a lot of you send me those things. That's a one-way communication, but I can at least know if that's something that you would be interested in. And there's some great platforms out there for this kind of thing, like Learnable, things like that you can have. It would be like a class. Unfortunately, none of those things are free. Those platforms aren't free. There'd have to be a cost, but it wouldn't be expensive. Maybe a couple bucks a class or something like that. But I don't want to do it unless there's support for that kind of a thing. So think about that. Let me know. Otherwise, I can just keep doing these kinds of podcasts. I'm going to keep doing these kinds of podcasts regardless. But I think that this kind of classroom, kind of masterclass environment could be really helpful to a lot of folks out there. But that's all I got for today. So like always, friends, get out there and take responsibility for your own spiritual education, because they that seek shall find. God bless.
You have just finished an episode of the Black Swan Rising podcast, an L10 production. hosted by Michael B. Rush. For show notes, transcriptions, and extras, please visit www.theblackswanrisingpodcast.com. If you enjoyed this episode, click the share button icon and send it to your friends and family. This will help to ensure the continued publication of future content. Michael thanks you in advance for sharing and looks forward to seeing you next time. Until then, keep seeking, for they that seek shall find.